Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. U.S. Secretaries of State and Defense Mike Pompeo and Mark Esper are in India for several bilateral meetings as well as the third India-U.S. 2+2 ministerial dialogue. They will be holding the dialogue tomorrow with their counterparts S. Jaishankar and Rajnath Singh. Both U.S. secretaries are also scheduled to meet with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and National Security Advisor Ajit Doval. According to the U.S. State Department, the ministerial dialogue will focus on four themes: regional security cooperation, defense information sharing, military-to-military interactions, and defense trade. The ministerial is also expected to lay down next steps for the U.S.-India Comprehensive Global Strategic Partnership. The talks are being held a week before the U.S. presidential election and at a time when both India and the United States are developing a negative approach to China. Apart from India, the U.S. holds such ministerial dialogues only with Japan and Australia. The Trump administration has already embarked on a confrontational policy with China, while India is witnessing a standoff with China in eastern Ladakh, a territory under occupation by India as per the UN Security Council resolutions on Jammu and Kashmir. Mike Pompeo has said China has a way of instigating disputes with its neighbors, and the world should not allow this bullying. Ironically, China has borders with 14 countries, and all are settled except its borders with India, and by extension a small portion with Bhutan, which lies under India's shadow. India, on the other hand, has land border disputes with nearly all its neighbors. To discuss the import of U.S.-India talks in the backdrop of a fraught regional situation, as also the broader U.S.-China tensions, we have with us Dr. Sameer Lalwani, who is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and Mr. Einar Tangen, who is a political and economic affairs commentator and joins us from Beijing. Let me begin with Sameer Lalwani here. Sameer, a lot is being said about what's going to happen. I just said in my opening, as per the U.S. State Department statement, the four themes, and of course there's going to be other stuff also, but security is primarily the thing, and in the backdrop lurks China. So and I was reading some of your tweets also, so I know that you've been observing the situation. What are we looking forward to in the dialogue tomorrow?
I think there are maybe two or three major takeaways from the fact that this meeting is taking place. The first is that this is obviously in the backdrop of a pretty significant and contentious election, and the fact that this is still proceeding and has been on the books for quite some time suggests the importance, I would say, in potentially even bipartisan support for the tightening of the U.S.-India relationship, regardless of the electoral outcome. This is like a steady process that's been underway for over a decade now. The second, I think, output that's likely to happen here is the signing of the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, which is a geospatial information sharing agreement. It's one that the United States has been seeking to sign with India for over a decade as well. It's one of what they call the foundational or enabling agreements to enhance greater military and defense cooperation. Again, it is a floor. It is not sort of a commitment to share things, but it is simply enabling the process or the possibility of that type of sharing. But certainly, since India is a significant importer of U.S. Arms platforms, having access to that geospatial intelligence along with the other types of information sharing that are available to it is in theory to enhance India's military potential. The third, I think, I imagine is going to be discussed, and there's been allusions to this in the reporting, is how the U.S. and India think about China, not just generally, but more specifically with respect to the tensions on the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh. And I think that is there are suggestions that this might be a little more forward-leaning than perhaps the United States has been in the past, at least in terms of overt assistance and potential intelligence cooperation. But that remains to be seen.
Right. Interestingly, you said forward-leaning, and I agree with you because a lot of this actually sort of plugs in with the BECA, the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement that you spoke about, which has been in the making for over a decade. And ironically, or interestingly, if you will, it was Indian security establishment that wasn't particularly interested because it's a two-way traffic, this kind of data sharing. But just for the viewers, there have already been 3 agreements: General Security of Military Information Agreement, there's the Logistics Exchange Memorandum Agreement, and Communications Compatibility and Security Arrangement. Now, let me pull in Mr. Tangen here. Mr. Tangen, normally sovereign countries obviously have the space, they can enter into any agreement. But sometimes when there are too many indicators that certain agreements are being concluded on the basis of some kind of external threat perceptions, and as I said in my opening, Beijing is being looked at both by Delhi and Washington, D.C. as a competitor and as also a threatener. So give me your sense of how you're looking at this 2+2 ministerial dialogue, and what do you think exactly is going to happen there?
Well, Esper and Pompeo could be very well dead men walking. I mean, they're coming into India, but in 2 weeks they might find themselves out the door. In probably all likelihood, they are. Biden presidency seems to be looming larger and larger as the domestic situation kind of spirals out of control, and their president seems to have lost grip with reality. So at this point, they're doing something in terms of the longevity of this. I would agree with my cohort. This is something that the U.S. has wanted for quite some time. They want to have sharing of information. India has always been very loath to share its information with anybody, but now they see themselves in a position where they'd like to have our U.S. satellites in a position where they can see exactly what the Chinese are doing and also get any other tangential information that the U.S. has to offer. That's still in its beginning phase, but I do think that there will be a reset at some point with Biden. I don't know that the Biden presidency is going to have the same love for Modi, although Biden is a big supporter of India. So it has to be resolved how this kind of conflict is going to work out. Remember when Biden was vice president during the early terms, Modi wasn't even allowed to come to the United States. So that situation is very, very unclear. We'll have to wait and see.
Right. Samir Lalwani, would you want to comment on what Mr. Tangen has said with reference to, the longevity of, what could likely be penned tomorrow, and also about the possible Joe Biden presidency in terms of any qualitative change with reference to, as Mr. Tangen has said, he's made a distinction between Modi and the U.S. approach to India. So what are your thoughts?
On the longevity of these agreements, again, these are, as I said, these are pretty standard U.S. Defense Department agreements with partners that we intend to have sort of military cooperation and potentially interoperability with. And so, again, this is a floor. It's not a guarantee nor a ceiling of the type of information sharing that would be enabled. But it's been ongoing, right? This process has been ongoing since the Bush administration through the Obama administration to today, and I expect that any future administration will continue it, because ultimately this is much more of a bureaucratic effort than it is a political one, right? The 2+2 is maybe sort of a political meeting at the apex level. But most of this is driven by the U.S. Bureaucracy, the Defense Department, the State Department, the intelligence community. There's sort of a large coalescence of interests here that are independent of the political leaders at the top. In terms of the Biden administration and its potential or what choices it would make, I think that the general trend lines, again, are consistent across the political aisle, and have been for, again, 2 decades now. That's one of sort of the arguably the successes of the U.S.-India relationship, is that it has maintained a bipartisan flavor at the top and in Congress. One thing, though, that you might see that I think both you and the other speaker have alluded to is maybe a rebalancing, so to speak. And that would mean that while the defense partnership is very important and is going to sort of be a central part of that relationship, there are other elements of that relationship that are also important that maybe have been less attended to over the past 4 years. And that would include trade, that would include other multilateral agreements and climate negotiations, other multilateral frameworks that India is interested in being a part of and the U.S. is interested in India being involved with. And then certainly there's an aspect of the nature of sort of the Indian political system and what it means for that relationship with the United States. So I definitely think there's going to be greater attention across the board and not just to a sort of the singular aspect of defense and military cooperation.
Right. So there are differences, obviously, but there are also certain similarities in the situation today and the situation in 1962. Now, you know, Samir, that in 1962, Pandit Nehru, then the Indian Premier, was shooting off desperate letters to President JFK asking for help. And while ultimately the Chinese withdrew unilaterally and declared a ceasefire, there was a very important sort of covert CIA operation that Pandit Nehru's government was actually had sanctioned, and the U-2s were flying from India and going to Xinjiang, and that's how the Americans predicted the Chinese nuclear test in Lopno. So it seems to me that right now also, with India seemingly under threat from China or perceiving a threat from China, and the United States already having decided that China is a threat, and this goes back to what you said about the forward leaning. So just give me a sense of if you agree with the kind of similarities, and if there are any differences that you might want to point out.
Sure. So I think there is a distinction between now and 62. While there is obviously a crisis on the border that involves sort of pretty heavy military buildups on both sides, I think that it's actually relatively more stable in some ways because Indian defense capabilities are not only much better than they were back then, but more able to defend the territory that they're staking out to defend than they were in 62. So what you described as sort of desperation, I don't think is present today. I think there's keen interest, and I think that keen interest has been going on for quite a while, and maybe it's sort of intensified of late because not out of desperation, but it's sharpened maybe some clarity about in the intentions of the Chinese government and the PLA. And so that, I think, is what's driving sort of a greater closeness of the relationship. But again, all this stuff has been and is in the offing for several years now, and this is sort of maybe a moment where China hasn't helped itself. I think it always has had an interest in trying to delay or prevent counterbalancing coalitions from forming, and the fact that this is accelerating is maybe sort of an indication that its strategy isn't working.
Thank you so much. That was Samir Lalwani speaking with us. Let me go back to Mr. Tangen here. Mr. Tangen, more or less the same formulation which I presented to Samir Lalwani. What I was basically sort of the thrust of my argument was with reference to what happened earlier in the 60s, was that once again the United States finds an opening in which it can plug in its own larger sort of national interest also, or the perceived national interest. So how do you think Beijing is observing this?
Well, Beijing sees a lot of what's going on in India as basically political maneuvering, using this border dispute to take away the daily headlines away from the handling of COVID-19, which I don't, put being held by the Chinese, and then they start building roads at a furious pace. From the Chinese perspective, they're preparing for something. They're not quite certain what, but they're not going to sit around and wait. They also remember 1962, and from their perspective, it was an adventure by Nehru, who thought that the Chinese would not respond. They did. It was disastrous. It resulted in humiliation for India, which is unfortunate because because it was a humiliation, India cannot forget it. And it seems to be one of the constant refrains that comes up every time there's some mention about this dispute. So at this time, Beijing knows that the U.S. wants to use India as a doorstop to China's expansion, or I mean, not expansion territorially, but simply economically. And they would like, instead of that happening, to engage with India. They've left open many doors. They deliberately did not mention how many troops died on the Chinese side. They've been trying to de-escalate this, but at the same time, they're holding their ground. They're not going to react weakly to this because it's a nationalistic game. So at this point, it's hopeful that Biden comes in. That he signals to India that he's not interested in supporting some sort of hot confrontation between India. At that point, people can get rational, sit down, and start concentrating on what is really important at this point, which is a worldwide economic recovery. India is slated, at best case, to only drop 10% of its GDP. Its per capita income could drop below that of Bangladesh. I mean, that says something. And it means that, wars are not the answer. Economic plans are.
Absolutely. With me, Mr. Tangen, I am also now joined by Arif Rafiq, who's a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute, a fellow at the Center for Global Policy, and is president of Vizier Consulting, a political risk advisory company in New York. Mr. Rafiq, thank you so much for being on the program. We were discussing the visit to India by the U.S. Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense in the third 2+2 ministerial dialogue, and what is on the agenda, a lot of which is basically related to defense, including the final basic exchange and cooperation agreement that's been there for over a decade now. So what's your reading of how we should be looking at this, and what are the threat perceptions from the Pakistani side and also from the Chinese side?
China obviously is the elephant in the room. This is the third of this 2+2 framework meetings between the United States and India. And I think, a major goal, as you had referred to, is to sign this BICA agreement, which enhances the intelligence sharing and signals and satellite intelligence sharing between India and the United States, and it brings India further into sort of a U.S.-led fold in the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean region. And so, India is increasingly procuring weapons from the United States, and this agreement will help India better harness the weapon systems that it is purchasing from the United States. So it brings the two countries together. India is kind of able to overcome its reluctance to sign these types of agreements with the United States, and it has this, or at least has created a perception that it aims to maintain an autonomous international or strategic policy and foreign policy. And so, it is moving closer into the orbit of the United States and relinquishing some of that independence by allying or aligning with the United States. For countries like regional states like China and Pakistan, they should obviously be concerned, because this will, probably lead to further weapon sales from the United States to India, weapons that can be used against them. This summer, the Trump administration sort of reinterpreted reinterpreted missile sales agreements or treaties that will now allow the United States to sell armed Predator drones to India. Those drones can be used against China. There's hostilities between China and India along the line of actual control, but they could also be used against a country like Pakistan, which is partnering with the United States to bring a negotiated settlement to this war in Afghanistan. So I think it adds some clarity to the U.S.-India relationship. There's more of a determined focus on dealing with the China challenge, but then it also muddies the water in the South Asia region, because it's also kind of pushing the region toward a bipolar order where you have India and the United States on one side and China and Pakistan on the other. That's not to say that this is going to happen overnight, but the regional architecture is being pushed in that direction by this embrace between the United States and India.
I agree with you. As a matter of fact, one of the, I have this analysis which has come out of India and says data received under the agreement, this BICA, will be useful for long-range navigation and missile targeting with enhanced accuracy. Given the current geopolitical situation, this data will be relevant on both the northern and western borders of India. So obviously, this is something that Pakistan and China will be watching. But when you say that the security architecture is being pushed in that direction, it now seems to me, and of course, it's going to take some time, we know that. But it seems to me that this is now getting entrenched. I want to ask you, because generally the general sense is that inside the Beltway, this is a bipartisan issue when it comes to looking at China. But in the event of a Joe Biden presidency, do you think that the approach would qualitatively change in terms, become more nuanced, and the Biden administration could actually look at the complete picture and say, okay, here are the areas where we can cooperate while we can compete and have strategic rivalry in other areas? Do you think that's going to happen, or do you think, some people say it's not like the last 4 years haven't happened, so it'll be very difficult for Biden to actually reverse this?
I think when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship and the U.S.-India relationship, there will be a lot of continuity. So as you had said, the past 4 years have happened. The Biden administration, irrespective of what its goals and its aspirations and its views for the region are, will be inheriting a world order that has changed in great ways over the past 4 years. And this U.S.-China rivalry has deepened. It's become psychologically entrenched in the Beltway as well. And I think the U.S.-India relationship has overcome great hurdles. India is on a steady path toward becoming an authoritarian Hindu majoritarian state. And while we see that there has been some criticism of the changes that are taking place in India from the halls of Congress, that has not resulted in any punitive action. No one is suggesting any sort of sanctions on India, any sort of repercussions for what's going on. And so I think in the end, you may see some cosmetic changes vis-a-vis how the Biden administration approaches both China and India. But in the end, it's national interest that will reign supreme. And there is a consensus in the Beltway that China is a national security threat. It's a great power rival to the United States, and that India, irrespective of whether it's a democratic India, a liberal democratic India, or a Hindu nationalist India that has relegated its Muslim populace to, second class, that India is a key tool to containing and restraining China in the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions.
Right. Thank you. That was Arif Rafiq speaking with us. Thank you also to Einar Tangen for his views. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the statement by Human Rights Watch that Afghanistan's vice president is trying to silence voices reporting civilian casualties. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about a statement by Human Rights Watch that says Vice President Amrullah Saleh is trying to silence those who reported a potentially unlawful airstrike that killed civilians, including many children. Afghan government forces were apparently targeting Taliban fighters when they hit the school at the mosque in Takhar. In response to early reports of the incident, Saleh denied on Twitter that any civilians had been killed and said that, and I quote from what he said, the person responsible for spread of this venomous and fake news was arrested immediately, unquote. The identity of the person and whether that person was arrested is unclear. On Facebook, he threatened legal action against those, and I once again quote him, who make false allegations, unquote. Human Rights Watch says that while the Afghan government has ordered an investigation into the incident, findings from investigations into other incidents of civilian casualties have not been made public, and no one has ever been held accountable. Fighting, meanwhile, has intensified in recent weeks, while there's been no progress in intra-Afghan talks in Doha. To discuss the situation, including the ISIS attack, and Amrullah Saleh's statement and what Human Rights Watch is saying, we have with us Ahmed Rashid, who's an author of several books and longtime observer of Afghanistan, and Dr. Jonathan Schroden, who's director of CNA's Center for Stability and Development. Let me begin with Ahmed Rashid here. Ahmed, give me your sense of how you look at it. Let's start with the almost no progress in the intra-Afghan talks, and then to what Saleh said, and finally to this attack that, the ISIS threat. They've again claimed responsibility for the terrorist attack. So give us an overview of this.
Well, I think the talks are really bogged down extremely badly. And I think the feeling amongst many Afghans, especially the Afghan government, is that the Americans gave away far too much too early on to the Taliban without getting very much in return. And we've seen, for example, that even this agreement, which means the Taliban have to hunt down Al-Qaeda and end their relationship with other militant groups, etc., has not been implemented. So the Taliban are not implementing their side of the bargain. And secondly, there's an intensification of attacks by both Islamic State and the Taliban. And a lot of the military attacks on Afghan military positions, government positions, are being carried out by the Taliban. And I think the other factor is, of course, there's disunity in the Kabul government. There's also, I think, there's been a shift in the Taliban. What we saw at the beginning of these talks with the Americans was the old guard leading the way and being in charge of the talks in Doha. I think what we're seeing now is the growing influence of younger elements and more militant elements in the Taliban who feel that they don't owe any debt to anyone and that they can continue the war until victory. Because you have had these younger Taliban constantly making the claim that they will defeat the Americans just as they defeated the Soviet Union. So I think we have a large number of problems to deal with. As far as Saleh is concerned, Saleh has been a target for the Taliban. There have been two major assassination attempts against him in recent weeks, in which large numbers of people have been killed. And I don't know what prompted Saleh to make such a statement. But I think trying to defend the Afghan government when they are as responsible as anyone is for failing to protect civilians is uncalled for.
Yeah, Saleh made another statement on which he was actually called out by Ellis Wells also, when he said Peshawar used to be the summer capital of Kabul, and talked about the international border as a disputed Durand line. Stay with me, Ahmed. Let me pull in Dr. Jonathan Schroden here. Dr. Schroden, a couple of things. One, there have been some analyses. They say that the U.S. military and intel has actually been indirectly helping the Taliban fight ISIS. So I want to get your comment on that. And secondly, Ahmed is saying that the younger Taliban want to take the fight to its end, whatever that means, what end that could be. But what we have seen is that every time the Taliban leadership has declared a ceasefire, they have ceased fire, period. So do you think that any sort of, fault lines within the Taliban, or that, some fighters are likely to say, well, we really don't want to get into this deal?
Yeah, so on the latter point, I mean, yes, I think there do remain some fault lines within the Taliban. As Ahmed Rashid pointed out, there is sort of a younger cadre, younger generation of Taliban who appear to be more militant than some of the old guard, as he pointed out. And so the Taliban have been quite cognizant of that. And one of their major focuses over the last, 4 or 5 years or so has been on the maintenance of the cohesion of their organization. And it's something that they continue to pay very close attention to and to try and take measures to avoid any types of splintering or fracturing of the organization. And so part of that, I think, entails allowing various commanders to blow off steam or to, conduct operations in various areas at various times and places. And to some extent, I think what you're seeing now is a manifestation of some of that, right? They've, by engaging in these negotiations in Doha, they put themselves at some degree of risk of having some of these fault lines emerge and having some of the, the younger or the more militant elements within their organization decide to not, fall in line. And so to some extent, they have to allow those elements to engage in some amount of offensives in order to placate them. So there is some amount of internal politicking, I think, that plays into the Taliban's decision to continue to employ violence.
Right. Ahmed, there's also a sense that the Taliban have opened their own sort of independent negotiating tracks with other elements who are not the inner coterie of the Kabul government, but are, of course, allies, and also those groups that were in power earlier. For instance, Hekmatyar has been talking about, actually asked for the resignation of the Kabul government, also says that, he's kind of making overtures towards the Taliban. So do you think there's a sense that the Taliban, while being in Doha and negotiating with the Kabul government team, are also trying to isolate the Kabul government from its various allies?
I think that is very much the case. And the point is that, the Taliban may be negotiating with people like Abdullah Abdullah, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and others, but they're not giving anything away. And that's the, they're not forging a new unity amongst the former warlords or trying to enlist some of the former warlords into their ranks. They're not giving anything away, but they are maintaining contact with everyone. Now, I think the same issue is with the Americans, that they haven't given anything away to the Americans. And that is leading to enormous frustration because we have no Taliban clarity on any significant issue, whether it's the woman question, the education question, the shape of the new Afghan army, how will there be a coalition government between Kabul and the Taliban? The Taliban have offered us absolutely nothing. And this is what is leading to enormous frustration and even fears among President Ghani's own staff, who have talked about a civil war, the possibility of a civil war. And that could well happen because Ghani's forces, which have been armed and financed by the Americans, are not about to give up, and nor the Taliban. And there seems to be a much greater focus now on both President Ghani and the Taliban fighting it out, unfortunately, rather than trying to offer some practical answers to the many imponderable questions that are not being answered.
Right. So what is your sense? I ask you this because you have been, looking at this movement from its very inception in the early 90s. What exactly do you think they're playing at?
I think, as Jonathan said rightly, I think the key issue is maintaining unity within their ranks. But that unity is coming with an enormous price because there's a complete lack of clarity on every other issue. How long can they maintain this question of unity? Does it mean that they want to all go into Kabul and take Kabul, and then there'll be a Taliban government, so there'll be no need then for any kind of explanations about coalition governments and addressing the woman question, etc. They'll do whatever they like. So I think this is the fear, and I don't think the international community has been able to put enough pressure on the Taliban leadership in Doha, in in Afghanistan to actually start offering some concessions or some debating points for the Kabul government so that the two sides can get together.
Thank you so much. That was Ahmed Rashid speaking with us. Before I wrap up, let me go back to Dr. Jonathan Shorten here. Jonathan Shorten, the same question. Ahmed says that the primary objective is to retain unity. Now, if we assume that there are fault lines and they have to retain unity, then we are assuming that the Taliban internally have not been able to work out a unified position. And that is the reason for there being no real progress in the talks, whether it's bilaterally with other warlords or with the Kabul government. Do you think that sense is correct?
Yeah, I think there was an interesting interview by the Taliban spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid over the weekend, in which he reiterated sort of the two pillars of the Taliban's platform. You know, the first being that all foreign troops have to leave Afghanistan, and the second being that there has to be, in their view, a reestablishment of an Islamic government. And he went on to be very clear that they consider anyone who is working for the current government in Afghanistan to be effectively puppets of the West and infidels, and the subject of an obligatory jihad for anyone who remains in Afghanistan. And so they are, at least according to their spokesman, completely unrepentant towards their attacks against the current government, as well as anyone who is even remotely affiliated with it, and that includes civilians. And so those are the two primary pillars of their platform, which they continue to repeat quite vociferously. But to Mr. Rashid's point, below that, they have been extremely vague as to what their platform is, what it is they want specifically, other than these sort of vague interpretations of what it means to, for the government to quote unquote be Islamic. And so it is very difficult to negotiate with them, to pin them down and to get them to move forward on anything. And it's one of the great struggles that these talks have right now is that, as Mr. Rashid pointed out, the Taliban don't have a well-developed and sort of internally consistent and coherent platform. And certainly neither does the Afghan government. They are at least as equally in disarray when it comes to their platform, what they're willing to accept and what they're willing to concede. And so until the two sides really solidify what it is they're negotiating about and from, I don't think you're going to see much progress in these talks, which is why there's been a lot of calls now for a mediator to come in and to try and help both sides with that.
That is about right, and the situation is very tough. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Jonathan Shorten speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at Indus.news. Good night and goodbye.